ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Hello, welcome to Conversations. This year, Conversations is 20 years old. We've been listening to 20 of our most memorable guests from those 20 years. Today's guest, well, he's certainly memorable. He's been on the show 3 times. This is my conversation with him from 2012. There are Australian journalists, and then there's Michael Ware. Michael Ware was a war correspondent for Time magazine, and then CNN, reporting from Afghanistan and Iraq. He was the only Western journalist in regular contact with both American troops and Iraqi insurgents. And he was able to report from those places in clear Australian English when all hell was breaking out around him. Michael has served the equivalent of 9 combat tours, more than any American soldier. He's been kidnapped 3 times. US Staff Sergeant David Belavia said this of Michael: "I can't stand the media, but I would go through hell with a bucket of gasoline for Michael Ware." Sergeant Belavia said this after a firefight in Fallujah, where Michael was right by him, armed only with a camera. Before we start, I should say that some listeners may well find some of Michael's stories quite distressing. Michael certainly does. He was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder a few years ago. He's trying and not succeeding to write a book about it all. Michael came in 2 weeks ago and we recorded this conversation. Welcome back, Michael.
G'day, Richard. You mentioned the B word. Nice way to begin.
The book word.
Yeah, you go again. Words can be harmful, Richard.
We're off to a rocky start already. How are you adjusting to civilian life in Brisbane?
Well, 3 months ago, 6 months ago, 12 months ago, it would have been a different answer. Touch wood, I'd like to think that quite possibly I'm through the eye of my needle. Put it this way, as Jack Nicholson famously once said, perhaps this is as good as it gets. Look, I'll be perfectly frank with you. The transition nearly killed me in a way that the war did not succeed in doing. It was very hard. Like so many others, like 2.4 million American vets and 50,000 odd Aussie vets, I found that coming home, the shock to the system, it's like someone throwing a bucket of icy water on you. You really have to consciously attempt to reclaim your life.
Is it the quiet that gets to you after all that noise?
It's the quiet, it's the noise, it's the crowds, it's the nanny state, it's the idiots on the road, it's all sorts of things. For me, my inability to be able to leave my own apartment or house, it's, for the first year and a half, stressing so much at the thought of having to go to the corner store to buy milk. It's losing my driver's licence because I kept swerving from rubbish on the side of the road. Or if someone drove up behind me and cut me off on a major road, that was a kidnap about to begin. Indeed, I remember one night driving to my parents' place at Caloundra from Brisbane and going up a darkened Bruce Highway. I sat behind a group of traffic because you don't travel with traffic because traffic tends to blow up. So I sat back there behind them, pacing myself, and all of a sudden the car in front of me, there in the night on the Bruce Highway, was hit by a roadside bomb. I saw the blast. Now, it turns out that was a speed camera flash. But I know I probably hit about 160 from there until Mum and Dad's place. It's just instant little triggers. And I've had to work very diligently at kind of deprogramming. Indeed, the quacks will talk about muscle memory, about learned responses, about all these sorts of things. And indeed, what they're learning now, because quite frankly, they knew nothing about trauma, essentially until the advent of the invasion of Iraq. By and large, our body of medical knowledge was pretty scant. The earliest work really began with female rape victims until they then realised that they had a bunch of Vietnam War vets sitting around going crazy that they started studying. And it's only since the invasion of Iraq that we now see a proliferation of money and studies and work and a national PTSD centre in the United States. And we're actually moving forward. In fact, from Iraq, there's 2 areas of medicine that I'm told have taken benefit from the conflict. One is in the area of trauma, in terms of post-traumatic stress. The other, I'm told, is in neurosurgery. Indeed, I've been informed that the woman congressman in the United States who was so horribly shot a couple of years ago, her husband, the astronaut. It's been told to me more than once that she's alive essentially because of the Iraq War. And so they're keeping people alive now that they couldn't possibly have hoped to done in 2002.
Talking to a returned US soldier once on this program, she said the thing that really annoyed her was people complaining about parking.
Oh, yeah. I have a zero tolerance for that sort of thing. But what I've learned to do is to tune that out so that now I don't hear the complaint. The nanny state of our modern Western society is something that obviously we'd like to be able to preserve because, I've got a child here growing up. It's a very pleasant way to live. But honestly, you could not be more divorced from real life if you possibly tried. It starts with peanut butter in schools. I mean, honestly, I came home from the war and my son could not take peanut butter to the depowering of the schoolboy rugby union scrum. The Wallabies haven't had a front row since. And it goes on and on and on. Bicycle helmets, a case in point. We really are divorced. I have a sense that we're missing out. That while we benefit so enormously from winning the genetic lottery and being born or raised in the privileged Western liberal democracy bubble that bobs along on the sea of humanity, it can be quite hard.
Mark Danner, who's an American foreign correspondent who came on the program a couple of years ago, had his own thoughts on this. He covered things like awful massacres in Haiti, and he wrote a book based on the idea that political violence strips bare the social body, and he thinks that allows us to see beneath the surface to the real workings of a society, that there's some kind of truth in that. And when you go into those awful places, just like you have done, you get closer to some kind of a truth. I have another side to that. I think violence doesn't allow you to see the nature of it at all. I think it traumatises the body and makes it behave uncharacteristically. And I think you see a weird side of humanity rather than a central truth about it. What's your view?
Well, how long do we have, Richard? This is indeed something that I've been contemplating long and hard these last couple of years. I don't think that the violence reveals a deeper truth about the human condition. I don't think that the violence traumatises someone and then they act uncharacteristically. I think people act characteristically having been exposed to violence. I've come home, I'm supposed to be writing a book, I've got a big fat contract to do that. Instead, I'm trying to push out some films and some TV projects and these sorts of things. So I've had to really go back and strip it down. When I first set upon these endeavours, I thought, well, what's there new to say about war? And therefore, what's there new to say about human nature? And it didn't take long till it came to me that there's nothing to say. There's nothing new. There's no new half thought to add to the human conversation about war. There's one story about war. There's one truth about war, and everything else is a permutation or a refraction of that. War is hell. And that's it. Innocence is lost. There's heroism. There's evil. War is hell. However, Danner's right in my view. I might put it a little bit differently though. In an actual firefight itself, or in an environment, in a society at war, or it's a society under siege, you really see who we are. Put it this way, if you're in a firefight, I consider there's a kind of purity to the sense of understanding that you can develop. When you think you're about to die, you really find out, and this is trite to say, what's most important to you. Those things that you're actually thinking about. Put it this way, it's not the mortgage, it's not getting to a football game, it's not, winning the office, rugby league pool. It's none of that. It's love. It's those whom you love, or it really comes down to these base things. So I found that, say, in a firefight, there's nowhere to hide from yourself. We all get through each day telling ourselves little white lies. I'm going to give up smoking tomorrow. I'm going to get in and clean up all those receipts and itemise them and, file them away. We fudge all these little things. In a firefight, there's no room for that. You can't pretend to be anyone other than you really, really are. More broadly, in a general state of war, so-called, to put it as simply as I can, what I saw evil men do good and good men do evil. It's where life is stripped bare And he's right. You see part of the inner working mechanisms of the human soul. You see its best bits, you see its worst bits. It really is humbling.
I think of you as a guy who's been right out onto the edge of life, but it sounds like you've actually been much closer to the centre than the very edge.
I'd like to think so. There's a great quote about soldiers in general that says, a soldier doesn't fight because he hates what's in front of him. A soldier fights because he loves what's behind him. If I had to encapsulate whatever the plethora of stories I'm going to be telling out of my decade at these wars, I guess the simplest way to describe any of them is that it's a love story.
So if you're in that moment, you're in that house, and there's a firefight breaking out, and you suddenly have this naked realisation that really it's who you love and who loves you that's really important. Don't you start to then panic because you go, oh my God, I just realised this and I'm about to die. Like, I'm going to get out of here.
Yes. Well, that's a separate thing. The human capacity to endure. I mean, we've seen it time and time again throughout history. What it is that a human being can become accustomed to.
Well, that's anything, don't we?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's these things, these questions that you raise, these things that we're talking about now, these are the things I'm finding have stayed with me. It's these questions, it's these musings.
Young journalists go into this sort of thing because they don't want to be on the sidelines of history. They want to see history being made. Does the appeal of that wear off after a while?
I know for me it certainly didn't. Someone once asked me, did you stay in Iraq too long? And my response to that then is the same as it is now. I didn't stay one day longer than I should have, and I didn't leave one day earlier.
Why? Why do you say that? I don't know why you say that.
Because, and it was a lot for me to acknowledge within myself it was time to leave, emotionally and...
Why? You had nothing to prove? You had nothing to prove when you were on this program 6 years ago. Did you? Or did you?
No, it's not about that. It's not about seeking external validation for that which we do. It's love. I had to walk away from my brothers. I had to walk away from a country in pain that I'd come to care very deeply about, that I'd assimilated into. Heck, I'm more Iraqi now than I am Australian. Indeed, there'd be moments when little things would arise in our day-to-day in Baghdad. The blood would rush to my head, surprisingly, and off I'd storm. And to hear my boys go, Mr. Mick, you're being too Iraqi. Calm down. That's what it was. And I mean, forget the story per se. Although as a professional storyteller, an innate storyteller, that's obviously something that's very important to me. That the story was still unfolding. It was, it hadn't reached its end. But even beyond that, there was a job to be done. There was, I had to nursemaid a certain thing through until it could, find its own feet and walk and take care of itself.
What was that thing? That sounds like you really overestimated your own responsibility for things.
I mean, we all have our parts to play. The world is but a stage, is it not?
So what was that?
They're open auditions, so we don't know what role we're ever going to get now, do we? Okay, take, for example, in Iraq, very, very early on in 2003, when we had the Vice President, the then Vice President, the then Defence Secretary, the President himself, standing on an aircraft carrier with mission accomplished in May. Combat operations have ended. Oh, my God, Father. There's no insurgency. They're a bunch of dead enders, criminals. It'll be over by Christmas. At the same time, as they're saying this, I'm going to insurgent training camps in the dead of night. I'm seeing these complex command and control military hierarchies being fashioned. I could see that these guys were not dead enders and that this would not be over by Christmas, and I could see that we were going to be stuck for a long time. Now, at that point in time in Iraq, it was very easy for a journalist to talk to a guy with a scarf around his head saying that he's an insurgent. Lots of journalists wrote breathless reports about meeting a guy in the back of a car who told them this and told them that. And there's validity to that. I had to keep saying, look, I believe you, but how do I know it's true? How can I convince my readers it's true? Show me something. So I found myself going deeper and deeper until suddenly there I was able to either correct or to speak against whatever it was that the Bush administration may have been saying or what the Pentagon was saying, or it was that I was able to give voice to the other half of a war. And there was a very key moment for me in late 2003 when I always figured during that year that the American military, the guys who were running the war, they knew the truth. And this was just a public line, that this was just the fodder, the feed that they gave out to the journalists and to the public. It was in late 2003 with an American general from the 1st Armoured Division when it really dawned on me. They honestly didn't know who they were fighting against. They really did not know.
And were they interested in your explanations for that?
Yeah, I mean, it was a bit of a mixed bag back in the early days. In certain sections of the American military, I'd be warmly invited in for coffee and a meal, and we'd all just talk and, spitball, so to speak. But we'd engage in a discourse of ideas and analysis. On the other hand, for example, one of the photographers who worked with me for years, an Italian chap, was out on a half-day embed with an American unit just to get some photographs of them moving around Baghdad for some reason. As he was leaving, the young lieutenant came over to him and said, "So, Franco, you work for Time magazine, is that correct?" He goes, "See, yeah, I work for Time magazine." "You don't know Michael Ware by any chance, do you?" He goes, "Michael, Mick, he is the bureau chief. Of course, I work for Mick." He said, "When you go home, can you do me a favour? Urinate in his face." So there was a range of emotions.
Right, it was the full thing, full spectrum response to Michael Ware, the journalist.
But as the war progressed, it wasn't to Michael Ware, it was to this voice.
To the voice, yes.
Particularly annoying and nasally and drony and Australian accented with a big broken schnoz. But as the war progressed, that very much changed.
You were embedded with US forces at one point.
Oh, and many times.
Many times. And you found that a satisfactory process.
Oh, very much.
What's the situation with our own armed forces? Were you ever able to be embedded with Australian armed forces?
God, the Australian Defence Force. Look, I love the ADF, and I was privileged to be able to see parts of what the ADF does in Timor and Solomons and other areas. It's one of the great regrets of my war experiences that of all the nations' military forces that I've embedded with, Estonians, Georgians, Pakistanis, Afghans, Mexican troops, the one nation that I've never embedded with is the Australians. We've essentially still got the same media-style engagement, the same sort of transparency in a liberal democracy as we had in the Boer War. The Australian embed system is a laudable joke. It's a disgrace to the media. It doesn't serve the military itself. The Americans, the Brits, the French, just everyone is so much savvier because the media can be an ally. And it's the public who mandates for these wars. I don't know what the ADF is afraid of.
You mentioned there your brothers in Iraq, your band of brothers that you had. Who are those guys? Tell me about them.
They came to call themselves the Baghdad Bad Boys. They're my Iraqi family. They were my translators. It would be my drivers. In 2003, it was one of the 3 sentries who used to sleep sitting on a chair outside our gate with an AK-47 draped across his lap. A very tokenistic kind of security presence. To the private army that I had to build.
A private army?
Oh, I love private army.
Like what kind of private army?
A real private army, goddamn.
How big a private army are we talking about? 50 strong. On your payroll? At CNN or Time?
Time magazine, yeah. I mean, I remember one receipt I had to send to New York that was for a sheep, a live sheep, and like 3,000 rounds of 7.62 millimetre ammunition and like 30 motors for rocket propelled grenades.
Are you serious? This is you need that many people around just you, or is it the whole Euro team?
The house. I mean, in 2003, it was the Baghdad Summer of Love, baby. In 2003, you could not get a hotel room for quids. There was every nation under the sky was represented. People were spilling into overflow little B&Bs and all this sort of thing. The parties were fabulous. I remember at 4 a.m. at the Humra Hotel seeing Scandinavian journalists playing nude volleyball. People were bed hopping. Everyone was trying to get laid. There was booze flowing. There was music. A year later, just a year later, you could have fit the entire Baghdad press corps on a city council bus.
What had changed?
They started beheading people. They started car bombing our homes. They started targeting us, as well as the Iraqi population, the politicians, the security force, and, the war began.
Why were journalists a target of Al-Qaida in Iraq?
Well, you're not part of the solution, then you're part of the problem, really, aren't you? I mean, more times than I care to consider, since 9/11, I've sat with Al-Qaida. I've been to Al-Qaida training camps. Some of my friends who started off as nationalists through the attrition of those horrific years, bit by bit, drifted into Al-Qaida. I had friends who were members of Al-Qaida. In fact, a member of Al-Qaida once saved my life. I remember back in 2003 when I was doing all this insurgency work and trying to figure out who these guys were and what is it they wanted and how serious was this and da-da. The first suicide bombings had just begun. And I was at this remote farmhouse where this friend of mine lived, and often we'd gather there, and he had a little boy almost to the day the age of my child. I used to bounce him on my knee for hours and goof off with this kid. And my friend was a really decent chap. He was a graduate of Iraq's version of West Point or Duntroon. As a career military officer. He worked in the Republican Guard, and came from a military family and all this sort of business. And there with a group of insurgents, we're all sitting down having afternoon tea and just, chatting like old women, gossiping. I spoke up and asked, so what do you guys make of these suicide bombings? Because particularly in the beginning of the war, they were very divisive. The nationalists, the patriots, would not brook with killing Iraqi civilians. So one of the hardheads there said, if there is an American soldier standing on a primary school, I will level the primary school to kill that soldier. And my friend sitting there, just very quietly, after a beat, said, then who are you fighting for? A year later, that guy was detained in a general roll-up of a neighbourhood by the US forces, and he went to Abu Ghraib prison when it was Abu Ghraib prison, the jihad factory. My God. Abu Ghraib turned out more members of Al-Qaida. I mean, you would have ordinary guys who were just rolled up in a neighbourhood sweep, could be perfectly innocent, just a plumber, a tradesman, or whatever, and they're just, wrong place, wrong time, whatever, confusion, roll them up. Theoretically, it should only be a few days or maybe a few weeks until they're sifted through and sorted and they're kicked loose. Sometimes guys would sit there for 3 years without ever being charged, ever facing a court, no one ever figuring out whether they're a good guy or a bad guy, and eventually they release them. My mate was in there for 9 months. Now, anyone who's seen an American prison movie knows it's the toughest gang that rules the prison, right? Take a wild guess who the toughest gang in Abu Ghraib was. Al-Qaida. So you'd have these ordinary guys. Now, and Iraq is much like Australia when it comes to religion. They don't pray en masse. They don't, they're not severely religious and all this sort of business. There will be ordinary guys there attending, because there's nothing else to do, a religious school each day in the prison set up by a hardline cleric who'd been jailed, and rubbing shoulders literally with foreign Al-Qaida fighters who just live and breathe holy war. By the time they're released, it's like put a young kid in jail and he'll come out a criminal, right? I saw that over and over and over again, how new jihadis were built from the raw materials of just an ordinary father. And so my friend went in as a nationalist fighter who, served in the military, believed that his commission in the military had not ended because of the invasion. They were just fighting a new phase of the same war. When he came out, he'd grown a beard. He'd stopped smoking. I instantly knew. The man who said that, who are you fighting for if you're going to use suicide bombers, went on to become what the American military called a Tier 2 Al-Qaeda leader who was directing car bombings through a large swathe of Baghdad. When he came out, I tried to see him a few times. And the message came back, you can't see him and this and that. Finally, I got to meet him twice in 2 discreet coffee shops where even his friends and brothers and cousins didn't know about it. And he said, everything's different now. I can't explain why, but I can't meet you anymore. I knew that it's because he joined a new organisation. He'd become a member of Al-Qaeda. What I learned later was that I tried to reach out to him and a message came back to say, listen, our friend, he's drinking. He's gone off the jihad wagon. He's of no use to anyone. He's fallen apart. He's a mess. When in fact, of course, he hadn't. He sent that message to me to discourage me from trying to make contact. Why? because his Al-Qaida leaders found out that he knew me, and they told him to lure me to a meet, roll me up and hand me over. And he didn't want that to happen, so he told me he was a drunk. And we never saw each other again.
Podcast, broadcast, and online. This is Conversations with Richard Fidler. Hear more conversations anytime on the ABC Listen app. Or go to abc.net.au/conversations.
As I was saying before, you were well known as one of the very few, if maybe the only journalist who spent a lot of time amongst the Iraqi insurgents, as well as being embedded with US troops. Was that controversial in the United States?
Surprisingly, yes. You know, there's emotion involved here, and there's, you know, I mean, goodness gracious, these people brought down the towers and now we're in Iraq for God knows what reason, and all this sort of thing. Of course, I understand all of that. And I just weathered it. For example, right-wing, bury-their-gun survivalist-type groups in the United States several times made death threats against me. I was called a traitor.
Do you detect a streak in the United States at the moment that's just averse to hearing things they don't want to hear?
Well, they don't like it, and they particularly don't like hearing it from anyone who doesn't have an American accent. I can tell you that now. I mean, I have a ex-girlfriend who's the first foreigner to ever work as a correspondent on 60 Minutes. No matter what her story on 60 Minutes was, it didn't matter. I mean, she was South African by birth. She sounded a bit more like a pom than anything else, to be honest. After every story that she would do in the comments page on the internet or this or that, there would always be, who is this foreigner to tell us about blah, 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 blah. American culture is something that's come to be of no end of fascination to me. I mean, growing up as a kid, you know, there was Coronation Street and EastEnders and Benny Hill, and, you know, we're all good little Anglophiles. But, you know, I was also raised on the Wonder Years and Happy Days and all these sorts of things. So in a way, I consider us Aussies, we were blessed that we were given the fruits of two thriving English-speaking cultures. But, you know, I'd always had a disdain for the brash, loud outspokenness, or the arrogance, it seemed to me, of the American culture. Well, 8.5, 9 years in foxholes with, let's face it, America's white trash, black poor, and its wetback illegal immigrants, I came to love the place. It still beguiles me, it still infuriates me, it still amuses me endlessly.
I just want to contrast two comments here. This is US member of the House of Representatives, Duncan Hunter, who accused CNN of serving as the publicist for an enemy propaganda film featuring the killing of an American soldier. Does CNN want America to win this thing? He's talking about your report there.
Yes, he is, in
and
2006.
I'm going to quote again Staff Sergeant David Belavia, who said, "I can't stand the media, but I'd go through hell with a bucket of gasoline for Michael Ware."
And he's a full-blown teabagger as far as I'm concerned. As Bill Maher would call them, a tea party. He's staunchly conservative, yet he could hold that view. But the story behind Representative Hunter, what he's talking about was in late 2006, where I'd been engaged with the largest faction within the insurgency, the guys who hadn't drifted to Al-Qaida, who from day one had always been about freeing their home country. You know.
Nationalists.
In the course of conversations with them, I sent them a list of 10 written questions. At this point, I was working for CNN. I'd just started by a few months. And the plan was to them to videotape their spokesman and send me the answers back so I could use it on TV. Well, they did that. They sent the video of their official spokesman. First time anyone ever saw him, even though his face was blotted out by a Michelin bubble. Accompanying that CD was another CD that wasn't marked. And when I put it in the machine, as I've done so many times with strange CDs from out there, there was this thing that's become known as the sniper video. Essentially, it was an insurgent combat camera rolling around with two-man sniper team. And so you're there laying in the car, specially fitted so that they can remove a panel and lay down and pick their sight and then just peel off in the traffic once they make their shot and displace. You could hear the spotter talking to the sniper about which American, or is that an American, or wait for him to do this. And then you would hear that clunk of the weapon discharging and the shell landing, and you would see in the footage, looking down the road, an American fall. There was 10 such incident. We aired that. We obviously didn't show the deaths. We blacked out and just carried audio.
Can I ask why? Why did you put that to air?
Because, one, America needed to know the truth. At that point, particularly, the sniper attacks had gone through the roof. There was an entire task force formed in secret to try and counter this. It was a very effective insurgent weapon. Secondly, American people needed to know what their kids were going through and how they were dying, because they couldn't rely on anyone else to tell them. But most importantly, because that sniper video was provided essentially by the spokesman as bona fides. I am who I say I am, even though I knew, but you know what I mean? It's like credibility to back up what they were saying. Contained in the answers to my questions was a very public, very much raising the herald and putting the flag in the sand, an offer from the largest insurgent group in Iraq, who was responsible for more of the day-to-day deaths of soldiers than anyone else almost combined, offering a peace deal.
With that DVD of Sniper Fire.
Mm-hmm. A peace deal. So that put everything in a whole different perspective. So when you hear the undiagnosed madmen like Representative Duncan Hunter going off their trolley and stomping their foot and having a tanty in Congress, what they're neglecting to tell you, of course, is the whole story. That, in fact, that came with a very public statement of what eventually came to end the war in Iraq.
I don't know if you've seen that movie, Welcome to Sarajevo. There's an amazing scene in it where they recreate the bombing of the Sarajevo marketplace.
Yeah.
And there are all these damaged bodies lying there bleeding to death. And there's photographers going around and not helping, but taking photographs.
That's their job. Yeah.
That's their job.
I did that.
Yeah. You've had those moments where, as a journalist, your clear and absolute responsibility is to take that photograph and tell that story rather than pitch in and help, which seems to kind of conflict with every other instinct in your body.
In all seriousness, I'll sit here and tell you that I participated in a war crime. That in choosing to do my job, in fact, at first doing it by instinct without realising, so desensitised had I become. But there was a conscious moment midway through this event where I realised what I was doing, and I continued doing it.
Can you tell me what you were doing?
Yeah, it's actually become a semi-famous in my own lunchbox incident, what I now call the Dying Man video. In April 2007, the day I started smoking again, oddly. I was with a battalion of American troops from a striker brigade. We did a pre-dawn air assault into a known Al-Qaida village. When we got there, it turns out Al-Qaida knew we were coming, and the village of hundreds of families was virtually empty, except for a few, left-behind families. Anyway, in the course of going in that early light, just as my camera was getting enough light to be able to record, we went in and searched a house in a farmyard. There's a family inside. While we're searching it, there was another group of Americans from our own unit on a building a couple of doors down that was elevated so they could watch the area, called Overwatch. They're watching our back. All of a sudden, in the entire operation that day, only one shot was fired in anger, and it was that one. Ting goes the shot. What was that? What was that on the radios? Turns out the boys who were watching our back saw this Iraqi running along the mud path past our house carrying a weapon. So they put a round in the back of his head. Perfectly legitimate shot. As it's now been oft repeated that I've said, unfortunately it didn't kill him. So the unit I was with, and the average age was like 19-point-something years, 20-point-something years. I was by far the oldest bloke in the courtyard. We dashed outside. We looked along to the brush on the side of the road, and lo and behold, there's this guy. At first, he looks like he's dead. Then it becomes eminently clear that he's not. We drag him back inside, close the compound gates, for a safer area, and unceremoniously just dump him in the mud there. Now, the Geneva Conventions say that when someone becomes your prisoner of war, comes into your custody, you must render them all medical aid that they require. The ethos being, if you want to be self-interested about it, we'd like to think that that's what they would do if they had one of our own. Well, we didn't give him medical aid, not even a Band-Aid. In fact, we made his passing that much harder. He was put in some discomfort. He was taunted, things were said. I recorded the entire thing from beginning to end. If I'd just cleared my throat, those kids would have been either shamed or shocked into doing the right thing, and in less than 11 minutes, that kid, he was about 19, would have been on a surgeon's table. Indeed, that battalion, not that platoon, but that broader battalion, 1 month almost to the day before this, one of their own had taken a headshot almost exactly the same. Instead of being dumped in a muddy courtyard while we all sat around and giggled and taunted and this and that, and then a heavy cloth was put over his face that he had to be sucking into his mouth to try and breathe through. That American soldier was surrounded by 5 or 6 mates, a medic, furiously working. Medivac came and took him away. He lived. Later the night of the day I was there, I showed my video to the brigade surgeon. He said, look, I can't tell you whether we would have been able to save him or not, but I'll tell you this, I would have taken him on my table.
What happened to you in that moment?
Not a great deal in one sense, because I'd made that decision a long time ago. And in fact, I kind of knew, there's a very dark place in your head and in your heart that those at war have to go to, be it to survive a 6-month Australian tour, a 12-month American tour, be it to survive the place where you were born and grow up for year after year after year. You need to go to a very, very dark place to physically survive, emotionally survive, mentally survive. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've stepped over dead kids, or how at our first house there was a little iron rail in the garden where few times it would ever rain, all the desert just turns to bog. So you come in and you use this grate to wipe the mud off. Heaven forbid it would snow, you'd do the same thing for snow. I used to use it all the time, but never for mud, never for snow. It would be when I'm coming back from bombing. And you know what's on the sole of your shoe. And so blithely you knock it off and crack a beer. I mean, it's just something that you have to, that you do. Or you couldn't bear the hurt of it if you let it in. So it's extraordinary and horrific what one can become accustomed to. At first, I was just filming these soldiers doing this to this kid, trying to capture their indifference. That's what I was filming. Suddenly I realised I was more concerned with the composition of my shot. I mean, I have rudimentary combat first aid. So I had this moment where I realised that I could at least ease his passing, let alone actually get him on the medivac. You know, the medic was 90 yards behind us. They were talking to him on the radio. Nah, don't bother. Took him 23 odd minutes to die, hastened by the difficulty of breathing. So technically, those soldiers committed a small war crime, if there is such a thing. Even though legally I'm a non-combatant and therefore not legally liable. By my silence, I chose not to prevent it. So in a moral sense, I participated in a very small, very understandable, very human war crime. And those American kids, I told you, they were 19, they were 20. I mean, the faces on the videos, honestly, you think they were at middle school, the poor bastards. They'd just come from 3-4 months in Mosul. They're in a very dark place.
And yet, for all of that, there's an argument that could be put forward, which is that Iraq was in terrible shape when we last spoke 6 years ago. Mm-hmm. Civil war has broken out that you warned of. Civil war is...
It's receded.
It's receded well and truly. Yeah. Al-Qaida in Iraq has now been kind of mostly crushed, I think.
Oh, no. There's still almost a couple of bombings a week.
Things have gone from being catastrophic to merely awful, which is a kind of an improvement of sorts, though, isn't it?
Well, I mean, you know, everything's in the eye of the beholder, really, isn't it? Put it this way. Iraq is now relatively stable, relatively self-managed, relatively non-threatening by and large to its neighbours. And all of that's fine as long as you support the fact that Iran now owns the country, that Iran is using it as a base of consolidation to project further power within the region, and that American interests are being completely knighted and humiliated. The Americans sponsored democratic elections, and I witnessed all of those elections. The ballots, the votes, this, that, the birth of hope, all this nonsense. All of the factions that comprise the Iraqi government, and that would be true until now, except for the involvement of former Prime Minister Ayad Alawi, who worked for the CIA for 15, 20 years. The Iraqi government was comprised of factions that were owned and operated by Iran. They were political parties. Some of them actually formed in Tehran during the Iran-Iraq War. Or they were the political face of urban militias that were sponsored, trained, funded, armed by Iran. Or even the Kurdish parties. The poor Kurds stuck in a horrendous neighbourhood with no true friend to help them. The president of Iraq, Jalal Talabani, a really decent man. I quite like Mum Jalal. The president of Iraq, the CIA lists him as Iran's number one agent of influence. He may or may not have any particular love for the Persians, but the fact is that his region in northern Iraq has one way in and one way out. If everything turns to hell, it's through Iran. He shares a land border with Iran. He must, by definition, have a marriage of some inconvenience with the Iranians.
So this is the upshot of all this blood and treasure. Billions of dollars, thousands of soldiers' lives, hundreds of thousands of civilians.
2003, Iraq was invaded twice, once by us. The other one, the real invasion, was by Iran. The minute the first American or British tank crossed north over the Kuwaiti border and pushed into Iraq, the West was in a proxy war of sorts with Iran, and quite frankly, we didn't then know it. Iraq is the largest Shia nation on the planet. In Islam, there's two basic broad groupings of faith. One is Sunni, one is Shia, akin to Catholic and Protestant. For want of a better term, let's say that Iran is Protestant. 60% of Iraq is Protestant. Under Saddam didn't like these Protestants, so he'd persecute them at every chance he got for political reasons. Then they had an 8-year war with Iran. Hundreds and thousands of Iraqi Shia, these Protestants, fled to safety in a neighbouring Iran, fellow Protestant country. Whilst they were there, particularly during the 80s in the Iran-Iraq War, hundreds of thousands of men and their families, Iran welcomed them as refugees, but it didn't end there. They saw them as valuable assets. So one small group was turned into a fighting force that was incorporated into the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. A few hundred men, about a battalion. By the end of the Iran-Iraq War, that was essentially a division of tens of thousands of men, Iraqis in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps fighting against Iraq. At the same time, they used all these people who'd come out and who go back and forth and have family and this and that to set up assassination teams, sabotage teams, intel gathering teams, all these sorts of things, political teams that would go in and try to destabilise. Now, when Saddam was removed, all of these institutions were still in place. All of them. Why would you dismantle them? So as we pushed north and just drove the Ba'ath Party and Saddam's regime out of office and left this gaping vacuum behind us, particularly in the south, where we would go through in the afternoon and the governor and the chief of police and all these people would suddenly disappear. The next morning, bang, there's a new governor, a new chief of police, a new district chief, They were Iraqis. They might have been living in Iran for 20 years. They may be on the Iranian payroll. So as we invaded north, they invaded west along 3 axes with as many as 50 to 60,000 men. And while the Americans eventually funded 1 or 2 TV stations, helped fund a couple of newspapers, the Iranians were running 30 to 40 TV stations, radio stations. They took over the universities. They funded all the mosques and the churches. They had, when it came time for democratic elections, take a wild guess which batch of Iraqis had a well-oiled, well-disciplined, well-practiced political machinery raiding the go. Indeed, in the 3rd term of the Iraqi parliament, there was at least 23 serving or retired senior officers of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps sitting in the parliament. Even better than that, one of the Iraqi members of parliament in 1983 blew up a US embassy in Kuwait and the French embassy in Kuwait. 17 of the Iraqis and Lebanese Shia who were part of this group who'd done this were captured and imprisoned. He and the other mastermind managed to get away. He and the other mastermind then went around hijacking airliners to try and get the Dawa 17 released. In time, those prisoners were released when Saddam invaded Kuwait, and the Iranians went in and got everyone and brought them out in the confusion. This Iraqi was convicted and sentenced to death in absentia for his part in masterminding the bombings. He was convicted under his rightful name, and it was all very public. 1983. Fast forward 2003, 2004, 2005. Under that same name, he's twice elected to the Iraqi parliament. When I first learned of this, it took me 3 months to confirm he was the same person as the bomber. I got it confirmed. I rang the US Embassy. It was like on a Thursday night in Baghdad. I said, hey, you know that this dude is this dude? My mate laughed at me, the spokesman laughed at me. The next morning, my producer came upstairs, Tommy, and said, hey, Lou's on the phone from the embassy. He wants us to go in. This dude blew up a US embassy, then had parliamentary privilege and immunity so that he couldn't be arrested and couldn't be touched. And just days before that story aired, he left Iraq and never returned.
When did you know that your time as a reporter in Iraq was over, when it was time to come home?
When two things came to a certain threshold. The first was that the building blocks of the peace were in place. You could see it. When some of these guys I talked to you about who in 2003 were fighting for their country, many of whom slipped over to Al-Qaida during the dark years of the war, the truly ugly years. Those same guys, the Bush administration that doesn't negotiate with terrorists, doesn't negotiate with anyone with American blood on their hands, put 107,000 of them on the US government payroll at $300 a month. It was called the Tribal Program, the Awakenings, the Sons of Iraq. It was precisely the thing that the insurgents offered the Americans in the months after the invasion. And it took the Americans all those years to come around to the original position. 4,000 odd plus combat deaths, 200,000 civilian deaths. And in the end, the terms that were decided upon were the precise terms that the insurgents offered me in the summer of 2003.
And it worked.
Oh, it was guaranteed to work. That was a very frustrating number of years. You could see all of this hellscape living and breathing around you. And you knew from day one it didn't have to be so. We didn't have to have the war in Iraq. Now, let's face it, there's two wars that were executed by the Bush administration. The first war was the invasion of Iraq, an entirely separate beast. I was in the invasion. It was a stunning military success, one of the greatest feats of manoeuvre warfare in recorded history. In 21 days, an entire regime was taken down with relatively very few casualties. It wasn't until the middle of 2003 that the war began. It's that war that we didn't have to have, the real war. The civil war, the insurgent war, the Al-Qaida war. None of it. And in the end, they put 107,000 Iraqi and Al-Qaida insurgents on the US government payroll. Bang! Almost overnight. The daily drip feed of ambushes and roadside bombs and assassinations on sniper attacks on Americans stopped. And that morning, Al-Qaida woke up dead.
You're a filmmaker now.
Allegedly, yeah.
What do you want to make a film about?
War, Richard. There's just not enough of it, goddammit.
So that's it?
No, it's film and television. The first is a documentary for the cinema, particularly for the US market. That's already in production, that one. Harkening back to our original conversation about the nature of humankind, when I was racking my brains for that one half thought to add to this human conversation we've been having about war and what it tells us about ourselves, the title of my film, as it currently stands, is Only the Dead. Because I realised Plato, that bastard, had stolen all my thunder. Thousands of years ago, he wrote, only the dead have seen the end of war. If that dodgy Greek is right, then that means that war, conflict, all of that is as much a part of the human condition as a mother's love for her child.
Michael Ware, I always learn about 5 or 6 things that I didn't know before every time I talk with you. Thank you so much.
Mate, it's my pleasure. Good on you, Digger.
This is Conversations with Richard Fidler.
That was my conversation with Australian journalist Michael Ware. If this conversation has raised any issues for you, Open Arms provides 24-hour crisis support to veterans and families, and you can reach them on 1800 011 046. 1800 011 046. And Lifeline is always there for you on 13 11 14. This program was created on the lands of the Jagera and Turrbal peoples, produced by Michelle Ransom-Hughes, and EP was Pam O'Brien. Executive producer of Conversation's 20th anniversary collection is Carmel Rooney. I'm Richard Fidler. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Richard Fidler. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations.